Welcome, everyone, to Women of the Military podcast. I'm really excited to have Naomi here to talk about her story in the military. So, welcome to the show.
Hi.
So, let's start with why did you decide to join the military?
Okay. I'm not sure it was really so much of an overt decision for me as much as my dad was in the military, my grandfather was in the military, and my mom was a military brat. Um, I often tell people I really identify with Mulan because she joined the military not because there was like a decision in there or she had something to prove. She just kind of knew that that was something that she could do and it felt right for her to do it at the time. So that's really what it was. Is I grew up pretty much. I can't think of a time when I didn't think I was going to end up in the military in one capacity or another. Really.
So, when you decided to pick a branch, did you go into the same branch as your family or did you pick something totally different?
Ooh. So I do have an army family. I ended up in the army, but the journey to that decision was a little bit longer. I actually wanted to be in submarines. My dad, when he got out of the army, went and worked for the Navy on their submarine program. And so I grew up knowing what submarines were. I thought they were cool. I knew how they worked. I was around them. And then when it came time for me to join the military, I found out that women couldn't be on submarines. So now I'm in the army. And
You're
that
like,
really was the
and my,
deciding factor. Yeah.
yeah. And that's changed now. All jobs are open, or is, right? Yeah.
Yep. All of them.
That's good. Yeah, because
Yeah.
that's like you're like, oh, I'm gonna do this, and then you're like, oh, I can't. I remember like when I learned like you couldn't do certain things in the military, I was like, really? Today? And
Right?
it took until technically after I got out of the military, they announced the change when I was still in, but then I had already gotten out by the time it went finalized, and it's kind of crazy to think about. It wasn't until 2015 when all jobs were open to women, which is not that long ago.
Yeah, it was less than 10 years, right? Yep.
Yeah.
Well, if we think about it, today's Women's Equality Day, the day we're recording this, and we're barely over 100 years we were even allowed to vote, right? So, slow progression, but progression, I guess.
That's true. That is true. And women haven't been allowed to formally serve in the military. That wasn't until 1947. So we're
Mhm.
less than 100 years for that. And so, yeah, there's been a lot of change. And it's crazy for, I think, the people who like grew up, in the 80s and the 90s, that it's like, oh, this is like huge change from like 1970. And it's just a short
Oh,
time,
yeah.
but it's like all these huge changes. So,
Right. I had an E8 master sergeant that was in the army when I first joined, and I would listen to her stories. Her name was Ann Cultrider, and when she joined as a WAC, so completely separate basic training, completely separate facilities, and she picked her job because she only had 4 or 6 jobs that she was allowed to pick from. So even when I joined, I was allowed to pick from a bunch. I just couldn't have the one I have now. um,
right.
so yeah, listening to her was incredible. Some of the things that she said she had to go through just 20, 30 years before I joined. So
Yeah. The interview before this one, I think there's if I'm remembering right, there was like a replay one, but oh no, there was a special episode the week before, but the other interview I did with Lori Neiman, she was in the WAC for like 2 weeks and then it disbanded and it changed. So she talked about like some of the challenges of like how being incorporated into the regular army on paper was fine, but there was a lot of resentment and different challenges she faced, and so that was interesting to hear her story. So
yeah,
yeah.
her story was incredible. I watched that one. So yeah.
So let's get back to your story. So you decided to join the army because you wanted to do some Marines, but that was off the table, and so you said, okay, I'll join the army. What job slash career field did you end up picking?
Well, initially I picked Signal because there was a unit close to my house because I originally joined the Pennsylvania National Guard. Actually, I was originally a National Guardsman, just part-time. Um, so there's a unit close to my house. I knew two or three other people that were going into the Signal Corps, and I understood and enjoyed radios and electronics. So made sense for me to join that field. Obviously, that's not where I stayed, but got a good 10 years out of the Signal Corps. Enjoyed the people, enjoyed the subject matter, loved learning a lot of stuff and working with civilian agencies as well. So got a lot of experience working with like firefighters, law enforcement, um, working in the
Yeah.
electromagnetic spectrum. I'm a nerd.
So what and were you in the guard the whole those 10 years, or did you switch to active duty, or what, or yeah. Just to answer my question, I'll
So,
stop talking.
no, you're good. I am something weird. I'm AGR, so I'm called Active Guard
Okay.
Reserve. So most National Guardsmen are 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. Theoretically, we deploy a lot and we do a lot of things. So it's not always 1 week in a month, 2 weeks a year. But um, there is a core of active duty soldiers called AGRs, and we're here every day. We wear the uniform every day, still work for the National Guard, but we're the people that do pay, that plan training, that make sure all the resources are there, do all the HR stuff in between those drill weekends because somebody's got to keep the lights on and make sure these units don't have to show up and do a day of paperwork before they can actually do any training because these guys have 2 days to do what the average active duty soldier has a whole month to do. And they are
Right.
expected to do the same jobs overseas. So we don't want to bog them down with, oh, well, now we have to you have to process pay rather than training on this new system, or you have to do all of your personnel work rather than, I don't know, learning how your cannon functions and making sure you are good to go if we go overseas. So that's the role I've filled for 15 years now. So I've been in the
Oh,
guard by definition my whole career, but I was only part-time guard for the first like 6, 7 years of my career.
okay. That makes sense. That makes sense. I've had a few people on who are AGR, so I sort of know what it is. I feel like at least I feel like you did the best way of explaining it, but it also has been a while, so maybe I just forgot everything that I learned. Summer is over and my brain isn't quite back on 100%. Um, so
You're allowed.
what you said that you were working with like civilian agencies, and like what was like your role, and I guess what was the time frame when you joined the National Guard?
Okay. So I joined in June of 2002. That is when I graduated high school. And the thing about that date is we were the class that September 11th happened during. 1 month into my senior year of high school, September 11th occurred. So when I joined with a whole lot of people that were primarily driven to join for that reason. So that was interesting in and of itself. Um, Also, we invaded Iraq in 2001, right? And really ramped up, or not 2001, 2002,
3.
three. Iraq
Oh,
2003, Afghanistan 2001 or two.
yeah.
Yes, it's
You
22
you
years
got it.
ago. All
I
right.
only know because I graduated in 2002, so I'm like,
Okay.
I know I'm tracking you because 'cause I'm on the same page.
Yeah, my brain is also trying to get back on track. This weekend's been insane. Um, but so yeah, 2003 we invaded Iraq. I was still in training when we did that. In 2001 into 2002, obviously we went into Afghanistan. So we were in training for pretty much going to war when I joined. So we knew we were in Afghanistan by the time I was at the end of my AIT, my advanced individual training for my MOS. We were going into Iraq. In fact, I left AIT and went to Iraq. So I got a lot of hands-on training very quickly. I enjoyed it a lot in the Army, and basically just continued to do that kind of thing. We were running the signal network for all of Iraq. I got to do a little bit of fiber optic network work elsewhere in the Middle East during that time. Um, yeah, we standard signal core stuff. We were making radios and phones and computers talk to each other so that we could actually accomplish our mission. Fast forward to 2009, and I actually became an instructor for the Signal Corps, and ultimately ended up switching states. So National Guard is controlled by states, right? Switched, went down to Delaware to continue to teach that and also to help develop courseware, particularly courseware for the parts of the National Guard that work with civilian agencies. So the National Guard's unique in that we have two missions. We have a federal mission and a state mission. And that state mission, especially if you're in a disaster prone area or if you just have a lot of military police in your state, that state mission requires you to work with civilian law enforcement. The US Code has us written in there. Title 32 is just what you can use the National Guard for. And that is a lot of disaster response, civil support. So if you have a riot going on, the governor can bring the National Guard in to help restore law and order, peace, things of that nature, really. So in order to do that, you have to be able to talk because, as we've seen in some very nasty historic examples in the National Guard, Kent State being one of the ones that comes to mind pretty much in everyone's history class, the lack of communication can have absolutely disastrous results, the opposite of what you want to happen. So we have that actually built in, and we developed a lot of interagency methods of just making sure that communication happens. So Army radios can't talk to civilian radios unless you do it right and you have intermediary devices. So there was that, and just working with those agencies was really cool. Again, got to learn even more about the subject matter that I was working in. So I got to work with FEMA a little bit too. So
Yeah, that sounds really cool, and it's a really cool way to explain, like, the National Guard's mission and, like, how it's so unique and different than active duty because it's alright.
the lights went off in my office. 1 second. Okay, we're back.
Just because you get to, like, you have the 2 mission focuses, and I think that's something a lot of people don't understand, and it kind of explains, like you were saying, like, you don't wanna spend all this time working on paperwork when you have this mission and you have 2 missions that you're trying to, and then there's extra work on top. I've never talked to a guard person who's like, "Oh, yeah, it was just 2 days a month and 2 weeks a year. It was easy." It was like, "No, that was, like, the minimum of what we did, and then there was all this other stuff that you had to do." So that's another, like, there's so much going on, and especially in 2001 to, like, 2000, well, I guess it wasn't until, late 2020s that, or not, whatever. It took 20 years for the Afghanistan war, but, that 10-year period right after September 11th, there was, like, so much going on, and it was crazy, and then there was stuff going on at home as well, so
Yep.
busy,
And people weren't
busy.
used to seeing the National Guard just deploy, right? So that was the National Guard was always the guys that stay back and wait for the hurricane. And then this war happens, and they're like, well, you guys are trained. Why don't you go? So,
Yeah. I mean,
yep.
I deployed with National Guard, and we were gone for 9 months plus 4 months of training, so it was over a year of being gone, and,
Mm.
I mean, that's a huge commitment, and not really what a lot of people expected when they were joining the National Guard, when they were joining the Guard, so it was kinda interesting,
Yep.
and then most of the people who deployed with me from the Guard, that wasn't their first deployment either. So, it also was like, they had done it before, and they actually had more experience than a lot of the active duty people, so that was really interesting as well. So,
That's pretty cool.
yeah.
Yeah, I like the way the Air Force does it, where they mix the active duty and National Guard together pretty well. Like it's a really cool structure they have.
I
So
deployed with the Army. as an Air
Oh,
Force
okay.
person.
Well, the Air Guard also does well. They deploy alongside there. But hey, welcome to the Army side.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was awesome. Yeah, no, I deployed the army on this like unique mission, and so it was like a hodgepodge of all these different people. And it
Nice.
didn't actually work very well because it was like there was no real play. It wasn't like a machine. It was like all these different groups coming together and having to try and work together. Um, but we made it through. So
You made the plan as you executed the plan, huh?
yeah, so but we made it through, but it was an interesting experience to say the least. So it sounds like you've been you've been in the national are you still AGR right now?
Yep, I am sitting
That
in my office currently.
so what kind of things have you seen and experienced over, the past I don't know. Now I'm like, we're getting old. 20 plus years.
Ooh. Well, I don't know. I guess can you clarify the question a little bit? Because I've seen and experienced a lot in 22 years,
Well,
and I'm still
we
seeing and
talked
experiencing.
about We talked about, like, you deploying, and we talked about you working with, like, federal agencies. Is there any, like, disaster response that you guys were involved with or, natural disaster or even, like, I know a lot of people in the DC area deployed from the Guard to support, like, the elections and different things in DC. Is there anything that you've seen or experienced that you think is worth talking about?
Okay. Well, I've got a few. So, like on deployment, obviously you're going to see a lot. Iraq was wild in 2003, 2004. We were kind of trying to figure out. We were trying. We It didn't go the way we thought it was going to go. So there was a lot of trying to figure out where the next steps were going to be. But got as a result, got to see a lot of the actual people of Iraq, which was pretty cool. And just most people overseas are just trying to get through their daily lives the way the rest of us are, and I think that gets lost a lot in translation. When you see war, it becomes this like it's a separate thing, especially for Americans, because we really haven't had a war on our shores, with the exception of September 11th and Pearl Harbor, since the Civil War. So
Yeah.
it becomes a very detached thing. So that was a big learning experience for me. My past two deployments have been a little bit more unique. I've been in some, I can talk a little bit less about them, we'll just put it that way. But on the flip side, I've gotten to experience some things that have been really cool and have changed since I've joined, which I'm sure we'll probably get to at some point during this conversation. But on the National Guard side, I think one of the biggest events that kind of defined or reminded the general public what the National Guard was the COVID pandemic in 2020. New Hampshire activated more than half of their total National Guard to support testing centers because it's a tiny state up here. They have less than 5,000 soldiers and airmen together. In fact, I think it's less than 3,000 soldiers and airmen together. My chief of staff would be very unhappy that I forgot the exact number right now, but he'll get over it. Um, but so we're a very small state. We don't have a whole lot of guardsmen. But we have a population that needed served. So we had soldiers and airmen working together, running testing centers, running vaccination sites, working the food bank. Um, our food bank presence was probably one of the best, most, trying to think, the people that worked in the food bank really took what they did to heart. In fact, I have two people that stayed and got full-time jobs working for the organization that runs the New Hampshire Food Bank, and they've made a career out of that kind of humanitarian work just from that experience. So And I think we saw that in a lot of other states to varying degrees. Some states really didn't have to activate their guards so much. Some states were up there around the same percentages as New Hampshire, well over half of our force, you know, working to help the American people rather than working to help the Iraqi people or the Syrian people or the Somali people, like places that we're used to being nowadays. So
Yeah, that's a really cool story to hear about, like, how the Guard responded for the pandemic and why it's so important that we have this resource and capability within the country because we do need people who can like step up and help and be trained for that response where if we didn't have that what would your state have what would have New Hampshire done? They would have been like, I don't know, like just show up and help, but then nobody wanted to leave their homes and like it just
right?
chaos
Yeah.
chaos. So yeah, that's a really cool story. I think that's really neat to hear about the different ways. I think there's just so many things happening in the military, and like if it doesn't personally affect your life, then you can just miss that it's happening. I was in Virginia and we were like the last ones to ever get vaccines. Like we
Oh,
wanted to
God.
travel somewhere in the state that we wanted to go to Boston and it was like you have to bring your like vaccination card and I was like I can't even get vaccinated like in Virginia because we were so like slow in figuring it out and so it was kind of
Oh,
frustrating because it was like even if I wanted to or if I didn't want to it doesn't matter. I can't. And so
yeah. It's like I have one
they're like
choice, which is no, apparently.
yeah. I was like, "I guess we're not going to Boston. We'll have to go
Oh,
somewhere else." And so that was kind of interesting. And I wonder if they didn't rely on the National Guard and that's part of why it was so slow. Or maybe it was just that we're near DC and there's all the kinds of stuff going on. I have no idea.
and
It
400
just
rolls of red tape that go along with it, right?
yeah. But what other, like, challenges or experiences outs that you what other challenges or experience did you have you experienced while serving in the National Guard?
Okay, well, I guess the biggest one for me is again, I chose the military because I wanted a career field that I wasn't allowed to have because I was a woman. Um, the same thing happened later in my career in the Army. While I was still in Pennsylvania, when I became an instructor, again, I was teaching radios, but they kind of paired my class up with the field artillery school that was down there. And I found out that a lot of the field artillery concepts, not just shooting cannons. Shooting cannons is always cool, but the math involved, the just the process for how you make that entire thing happen. You don't just go load a cannon, pull the trigger, and it goes now. Um, it's a much farther range weapon. You have to make sure it's not going to land on a school. You have to make sure it gets where it needs to go. It gets where it safely needs to go, as safe as artillery can be. But I was around it a lot, realized I really liked this field, realized it was closed to me because, again, I was a woman. The people that I was working with in Pennsylvania actually went above and beyond. They let me take the course to try and get qualified on a cannon. And they were told, no, you can't give her the piece of paper that says, yes, she's qualified. She has finished this course because she is a woman and we don't allow that. So they tried, but I left Pennsylvania and went to Delaware with kind of a nagging itch in the back of my brain. I won't say it was a chip on my shoulder because that kind of makes it sound like I was jaded, but I had this itch I could not scratch now. And while I was in Delaware, they opened part of field artillery to women, and it wasn't all of it. It was the counterfire radar and the fire direction. So the people who identify things in the air with a radar, and the people who identify how and who is going to shoot at what and make sure it goes to where it's supposed to go safely, without taking out the wrong things. And a job opened up in New Hampshire, so I applied for it. And a lieutenant up here, so not a high ranking officer or anything like that, took a stab on a female staff sergeant from Delaware that he had never met before and said, you know what? She won. I won the interview by his grading. He's like, and we're going to not. We're just going to do this. So he hired me. I came up here, and ultimately, I became the first woman to have my job as a firefinder, radar operator, and maintainer. And that's not just in the Guard. That's Army wide. I'm the first one. Um, during my reclass, I will say my fellow classmates were all about the same rank as me, and they were generally very, very accepting of the fact I was there. But that hasn't always been the rule since I joined this field. It's gotten better progressively, but being the first one, similar to what our wax sisters had to deal with when the wax were disbanded. And again, like she said, doing things on paper and doing it in real life it doesn't go at the same pace.
Right.
So I have dealt with units that would not talk to me and wouldn't let me in their area to talk about what information I needed from them in order to get my radar into this grand scheme of things. I've dealt with people. I actually, in one meeting, actually had somebody tell me to be quiet, men are talking. I've dealt with that one. That was hilarious because the lieutenant that hired me went a little bit, he took that personally and he let them know that he took that personally. And I will point out, these are not New Hampshire units that I've had problems with. These are units that didn't know me, hadn't been around me before. What else have I had? Oh, when I went to one of my schools, so like in any branch, you've got a progression of schools as you get promoted to different ranks. My senior leader course, I was the only woman. I was the first woman through, and as a result, after class, everyone else went out places, and I was on my own. So I went to every museum within a 2.5 hour drive of Fort Sill because weekends are really boring around Fort Sill if you don't know how to plan your time very well. But just things like that, especially in the first couple of years. But it's been 12 years at this point. I took this job in 2012, and one of the interesting things that I mentioned we would probably get to is this most recent deployment. I deployed in 2022 to the Middle East. And from being the only one for a little bit over a year, I actually took enough other women with me that had my job where I could have made a complete radar team out of women if I had wanted to. So I went from being the exception to having a posse of these overachieving women who joined knowing that they were still going to be in the minority, and it did not matter. They just wanted to do their job very well. And then all of them, I'm so proud of every single one of those women that I went overseas with. And they're all still in.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That's really cool. I love hearing about like how not only like I mean, I don't like hearing about how hard it was because I mean, I know what that's like. I know how challenging it can be to be like one of the only the only woman or very few women. But it's really cool to see like even now like it's been 12 years and you can already see the legacy of like what you and other women did. You opened the door for women to be in that role, and it's so cool to be able to see that not like in your lifetime, but within like less than 15 years, you can
Right?
already see huge changes, and that's really cool. And I think it shows like why the laws needed to be changed because women were capable and ready to do the job, and the only thing preventing them were people saying, "No, you're a woman. That's you can't do it." It's like, no, give me an
Right?
actual reason. And so
Yeah.
it's really cool. It's really cool to hear how much has changed in such a short time and how the military is changing. I think on a positive note in so many ways because that law was changed and those restrictions were moved away, allowing women to do whatever they wanted to do. And so that's really cool.
Yeah, it's awesome. And honestly, this new generation coming in is uh, the people that are our age had a little bit of a learning curve when we joined, and you know, oh, be quiet around the woman that's here. Oh, you don't want to say something wrong around the woman. This current generation coming in does not see that distinction whatsoever. Everyone's just a soldier. And yes, you do have exceptions out there. You do have people that are still like, this is the gender role and this is the other gender role. And we don't cross that. But by and large, my soldiers now, you can tell which ones are kind of the old crew that was around at the turn of the century, as messed up as that sounds, coming out of my mouth, and the people who have come in since like 2015, since this law had been changed. So, like, when I first came up, and it was mostly people my age, the guys had a little bit of a problem with me maybe sharing the barracks with them or the tent. This current group of people coming in, again, sees they're very respectful with each other, but sees no distinction and no issue with everybody being in close proximity and just doing your job and being
Yeah.
a big one big family essentially. So
Yeah, I mean, when I was deployed, by the end of the deployment, the guys were like, "It makes more sense for you to stay in our tent." Which at the beginning of the deployment, I would have been like, "There is no way I'm sleeping in a tent full of guys." But at the end, it was like, "No, if you it was just our unit and it wasn't like other people." So like it was people I knew and I trusted and it was like a safe environment and we were all on the same schedule, unlike the women's tent where everybody goes and they're all on different schedules and you don't get any sleep at all. Because we would go to Bagram a lot to do missions, and so whenever we went to Bagram, we'd be like, "Okay, well, I'm not sleeping," and then finally they were like, "Why don't we just all stay in the same place?" And then you guys could like, and it was like we were really
yeah,
respectful, and there were boundaries and everything, but it was just it made more sense to do it that way, and it took the whole like 7 of the 9 month deployment to figure it out, but by the time we got to the end, it was like, okay, this is a much better situation and it makes it a lot easier on everyone. So,
yeah, and you established a precedent that other people that they could carry forward with other women that came into that kind of a
yeah,
group. So
we were like, we don't talk about this to anyone. It was funny because the commander came and he wasn't originally supposed to be there. And like, I think he showed up like 2 or 3 days after we had already been there. He's like, cool, I'm good.
yeah,
And we were just like, ah, is he gonna freak out? But then he was like, it makes sense to me. And I was like, okay, we're good to
you're
go
like,
then.
all
So
right,
that was
yeah,
kind of, yeah. Because
that's
there was
awesome.
still, like, strict rules, like, women can't be in the tent and all these things, and we were like, "Yeah, whatever, we're just gonna do this because it makes logically more sense," and so,
Yeah, it's
you
like
know,
we're just
it's kind
okay.
of
Yeah,
funny to
try
see
it. Try and take her away from us. Sorry.
that we've got it covered. So, um, is there anything else from either your career now or the, like, work you're doing today that we didn't talk about that you wanted to highlight before we wrap up?
Mm, wow, that's a loaded question. Okay. I don't know. I think maybe I just want to mention that for obviously we've had a couple of years now where it's kind of there's been a spotlight on certain aspects of military life, especially when it comes to being a woman. Um, Fort Hood. I don't honestly remember what we turned Fort Hood to, like what the new name is off the top of my head, but I believe it's
I think it's
Cavazos. Yes.
Carvassos, yeah.
Yep, Cavazos.
Look at
That's it.
that, we got it.
Woo! Win! But back when it was Hood, yeah, we established that there was a problem in the greater army based on what was happening at that post. Sexual assault, sexual harassment, murder Like who thought an army post was going to have a murder problem, right? But that's the press that a lot of people hear. Um, and sad to say, the statistics in the past have kind of supported that kind of environment. But even since I've joined over the past 22 years, and I'm sure, I mean, we've just highlighted one great example where both of us have had an environment where we did not have that issue. Responsible people were just respectful of whoever was in their unit, just being a human being, and did things appropriately. And that's the vast majority of the military. You have bad people everywhere, but things have gotten a lot better. When I first joined, we had really no way of efficiently reporting if there was an issue or taking care of an issue, or basically if somebody sexually harassed or assaulted you, you could bet that you were going to be labeled a problem, moved somewhere else. It was probably going to damage your career, and they were going to be promoted to command sergeant major or something like that. Some ridiculous things. Nowadays, they've identified that this is a problem, and I think a little bit by force, but as a result, we're seeing a fix to that problem. We're seeing a lot of people that are a lot more engaged, a lot more proactive about what's going on within their commands. So, to somebody who may be looking at the military as an option, but is maybe hesitating because of what they've heard, especially again, things in the past, statistics legitimately supported that it wasn't a really great environment. I can assure you that, things move forward. Are we perfect? No. Look at it. Neither one of us were allowed to have any job we wanted when we first joined. Before us, Master on Cult Rider had 4 choices, and her commander was allowed to tell her she had to wear a skirt every day. Things have gotten incrementally better. And they will continue to get incrementally better, but only if we have women in the force who are going to keep things moving in that direction. The minute we all turn tail and run away, it doesn't get any better. In fact, it reinforces the negative, really. So,
Yeah, it's so true. Yeah, because you have to have 30% of the population believing something before you can make change. And right now, there's less than 30% women in the military. It keeps going up. But now we have, men who want to make change along with women. And so that starts to turn the tide. And the more women we get, the more we can even, have more people at the table making decisions and change the environment. And yeah, the way you describe the military when I joined, which is when I joined a little later because I went to college and then I joined, but it was that way. Yeah, you were like you just didn't say anything, and it's I'm
yeah.
so proud of like the way this generation has stepped up and been like that isn't okay, and we need to speak up and we need to change things, and I think it's so great because I feel like looking back, I'm like, why did we do that? And it's just that's the way it was, and that was what we were, and so it took a lot of courage for things to change and for people to step up, and I think that's amazing because that's the only way we can have change is by being brave and speaking up. But so I'm really glad there's positive things changing. So you gave a little tiny bit of advice, but you get to give me you get to give you more advice. So I'm going to end the interview with what advice would you give to someone who's considering joining the military?
Hmm. Well, my advice would be to do your research into the values behind what you are joining. So we see it a lot in the National Guard, particularly because the states have education benefits on top of things, on top of the federal benefits. We've got a lot of people that join to think just because they think they're going to go to college and do the 1 weekend a month, 2 weeks a year. Actually, look into the value system and what you're getting into because it is a big commitment. That said, there is a big reward um, if you allow it to be a big reward. So yes, you might end up having to give up a semester or two of college because COVID happens, and now all of a sudden you are the hero on the street giving everyone their COVID tests so they can get on their planes, and you have to have documentation of that. You may have to give up a year because you're going to Africa to keep the peace, or the Middle East to work with our neighbors there. We are actively building alliances and just making that a more stable area. And you might have to do that. We're not the old National Guard. If you join the regular Army, you know there's a deployment cycle. If you join the Air Force, you know there's a deployment cycle. But look at what you're getting into. But on the converse side, you get leadership experience that nobody else is going to have. The stories you can tell are going to make the people around you just their jaws hit the floor. You're going to be able to see places that maybe you would never see. I can't think of anybody that doesn't have family history in Syria that would wake up this morning and be like, yeah, that's a great vacation spot right now. And yet, I've gotten to see that country. I've gotten to meet those people. It's beautiful. The experiences you have are great. The friends you make, the network you create, especially on active duty, because you move around so much and you're all over the country, that's going to follow you. Even being National Guard most of my career, I've got friends all over this country. I could go to any city and know somebody, and that person is also going to have a connection with me. It's not like my high school buddy moved to Dallas and now I'm there, but we don't have anything in common at all. There's like a brotherhood or a sisterhood there. There is, and it's not something that you can fake it. It's not something you can get from anywhere else. And on top of that, you can use all of the benefits that they give you to set yourself up for the rest of your life. I'm in law school right now. The Army is paying for law school. I am not going to have student loans. I haven't had any student loans, and I'm going to eventually retire from the Army, and I'm going to be able to go fully stocked into my next career because I've been able to use my benefits to set myself up. And maybe it's not college, maybe it's trade school, maybe it's certifications in tech. There's options for all of that. You have to know what your goal is, and you can make it work. You can make it happen.
I think that's great advice. I agree. It might require more than you initially think on paper, active duty or National Guard or Reserve, but the benefits are so great, and that network and the connections that you make while you're in the military, it stays with you for life. And so it's so important, and it's given me so many opportunities, and I'm so grateful. So thank you so much for being a guest. Thank you for sharing your story. I really appreciate your time.
Of course. It was great to get to meet you as well. Your story is also amazing. So it was nice to meet you in
Okay.
person.
Thank you.